In the late 1980s, airport security officers at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris became accustomed to seeing the same man sitting in Terminal 1 day after day. He carried a red plastic suitcase, stacks of documents, and a calm, almost detached expression. He rarely raised his voice, never caused trouble, and followed airport rules meticulously. At first, staff assumed he was a traveler waiting for a delayed flight. Then they thought he might be someone who had missed a connection. But days became weeks. Weeks became months. And eventually, the truth became clear. This man lived inside the airport. His name was Mehran Karimi Nasseri, an Iranian national whose story would become one of the most unusual and longest-running cases of statelessness in modern history. Nasseri's presence inside the terminal wasn't the result of eccentricity or personal choice. His situation was the consequence of complex political upheaval, legal confusion, and bureaucratic failures that spanned multiple countries. According to his own account, he left Iran in the 1970s after protesting against the Shah's regime. He sought asylum in Europe, moving between nations as he attempted to secure legal refugee status. Eventually, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees granted him refugee papers in Belgium, giving him the right to live in any European Union country. But in 1988, while traveling to London, Nasseri claimed his bag, containing all his original documents, was stolen at a Paris train station. Without official papers, he was denied entry into the United Kingdom. British authorities placed him back on the plane to France. When he landed, French border officers faced an unusual dilemma. He had no documents proving his identity, no passport, no country willing to accept him, and no evidence that he had come from France in the first place. France could not legally deport him. Britain refused to take him. Iran did not recognize him. Belgium would not reissue his documents unless he appeared in person, which he legally could not do. And so the airport became the only place where he could physically remain without breaking the law. Terminal 1 turned into his residence by default. He slept on a red bench. He stored his items under a flight information board. Airport employees gave him food, coffee, blankets, and occasionally shaving kits. Cleaning staff learned his routine and worked around him. Police officers checked on him but no longer questioned his presence. What made his situation particularly extraordinary was not the length of time, at least not yet. But the fact that everyone involved expected the issue to resolve itself within a matter of weeks. Immigration authorities, human rights lawyers, and airport personnel believed a solution was inevitable. But every attempt to clarify his legal status met another barrier. Airlines required documents for international travel. Governments required documents for border entry. Nasseri had none. And retrieving new papers required travel he could not legally perform. By the early 1990s, the case had become a bureaucratic loop with no exit. Nasseri continued to live in the terminal, maintaining an orderly routine. He shaved in public restrooms, wrote in notebooks, and responded politely when airline staff approached him. Passengers mistook him for a traveler between flights, unaware they were watching a man who had already lived in the airport for years. Airport workers later described him as quiet, disciplined, and predictable. He kept track of time through the daily rhythm of departures and arrivals. The constant soundtrack of rolling luggage, boarding calls, and jet engines became normal. He existed in a world designed for movement, even though he himself could not move at all. By the mid-1990s, Nasseri's story began to attract journalists. What they discovered was not a stunt, not a protest, and not an act of voluntary homelessness. It was the lived. Through the 1990s, Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle Airport evolved around the presence of one man. Airport staff rotated, airlines changed, and security systems modernized, but Mehran Karimi Nasseri remained in the same place, a bench near a moving walkway in the departure hall. What began as a legal mishap slowly turned into a long-term human anomaly. A man who existed entirely inside an international airport without citizenship, without a passport, and without the ability to step outside the building. During these years, Nasseri built a daily routine that allowed him to survive in an environment never designed for long-term living. He woke early to avoid disrupting cleaning crews. He kept his few belongings organized inside his red plastic suitcase, which became an unofficial symbol of his presence. He read newspapers left behind by travelers, wrote long notes in his journals, and watched people rush by with destinations he could never reach. One of the unique aspects of his life was the rhythm. Airports operate on a 24-hour cycle, with no true distinction between day and night. For most travelers, this constant movement was temporary, lasting only a few hours. For Nasseri, it became the background of his entire existence. The announcements, the footsteps, the echo of rolling suitcases, the distant roar of jet engines, these were his markers of time. Airport staff developed a soft familiarity with him. Employees who worked the same shifts saw him every day. Security officers performed routine identity checks, but the outcome never changed. He was legally allowed to remain, yet unable to legally leave. Some workers brought him sandwiches or hot meals from employee cafeterias. Others donated toiletries or gave him reading material. He was not treated as a threat or an intruder, but as a permanent fixture of the environment, the man who simply lived there. Despite the strangeness of his situation, Nasseri was not without personality. Travelers who approached him described him as polite, formal, and often eager to explain his story. He spoke calmly, sometimes in lengthy detail, about his past, his family in Iran, and his aspiration to reach the United Kingdom, where he claimed his mother lived. Whether every detail was accurate became a matter of speculation among journalists, but to Nasseri, these stories were real and central to his identity. Legally, his situation grew even more complicated over time. In the mid-1990s, Belgian authorities confirmed that they had previously issued refugee papers to him, giving him the right to live in Belgium. However, they refused to send replacements unless he appeared there in person. French officials could not escort him to Belgium because he lacked the documentation required to board a train or plane. Immigration lawyers attempted to intervene, but the case stalled repeatedly. Each government involved recognized the legal tangle, yet none could produce a definitive solution. His case attracted attention from human rights organizations, legal scholars, and investigative journalists. Articles appeared in major European newspapers, portraying him as a symbol of bureaucratic failure. Some reporters questioned inconsistencies in his story, while others focused on the systemic issues that left a man in legal limbo for years. Regardless of interpretation, the core reality remained unchanged: he was stuck in Terminal 1 without a legal path out. As his story spread, passengers began to seek him out intentionally. Some approached with curiosity, others with sympathy. A few handed him small gifts, snacks, pens, postcards. He accepted these gestures with quiet gratitude but rarely asked for anything. He maintained a dignified demeanor, even as the years passed and his life remained confined to a small corner of an airport hall. By 1998, he had lived inside the terminal for a full decade. He was known to nearly everyone working there. His seat, his suitcase, and his routines were documented by news outlets around the world. Yet the most remarkable aspect was how seamlessly the airport adapted to him. It was almost as if the building had absorbed him into its daily operations. Outside of the terminal, legal negotiations continued sporadically. The French government reviewed his situation multiple times but found no legal grounds to forcibly move or deport him. His case lacked precedent, and international asylum laws at the time offered no clear solution. Each attempt at resolution. By the early 2000s, Mehran Karimi Nasseri had lived inside Terminal 1 for more than 12 years. His presence was no longer a curiosity, it had become an established part of the airport's identity. Employees gave directions by referencing him, past the man with the red suitcase, or near the bench where the resident sits. Travelers photographed him, sometimes without permission, assuming he was part of the airport's atmosphere. For many, he was a story to tell friends. For him, this was simply life. During these years, his case gained international recognition. Journalists documented the daily routine of a man who had not stepped outside an airport building in over a decade. Legal experts debated the systemic failures that had left a human being trapped in a public space. Scholars discussing statelessness began citing his case as one of the most extreme examples of a person caught between borders. Meanwhile, Nasseri continued following the same predictable rhythm, waking early, organizing his belongings, shaving in airport restrooms, and writing notes in his journals. His red suitcase remained beside him at all times, not because it held valuable items, but because it symbolized the idea of travel he could no longer participate in. In 2003, after years of public attention, a major shift finally occurred. French authorities and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees revisited his case. After extensive review, they determined that he did, in fact, have refugee status in Belgium, and Belgium agreed to reissue his documents, under one condition: he had to sign paperwork acknowledging that he was Mehran Karimi Nasseri, born in Iran. This requirement presented a new barrier. During his years in the terminal, Nasseri had gradually rewritten parts of his identity. He began referring to himself as Sir Alfred, claiming different origins and presenting alternative narratives about his family. Whether this was a psychological adaptation to long-term isolation, a coping strategy, or confusion caused by stress, no one could determine with certainty. What mattered was that the name he now used did not match the legal identity required to release him. Officials attempted to convince him to sign the documents. They explained the process, the benefits, and the finality of the resolution. But Nasseri refused. He insisted that the documents did not reflect who he believed himself to be. Without his signature, the refugee papers could not be issued. After so many years of waiting for a solution, the moment it became available, he rejected it. This decision puzzled airport staff, legal advisors, and reporters alike. Many interpreted it as a sign that years of confinement had altered his perception of the world and of himself. Terminal 1 had become his environment, predictable, controlled, and familiar. Leaving it meant stepping into a life he no longer recognized or trusted. In 2004, interest in his case surged again when Steven Spielberg's film, The Terminal, loosely inspired by Nasseri's life, was released. Although the movie fictionalized many aspects, it drew global attention to the real man still living in the Paris airport. Some viewers assumed he had already left. Others believed he chose to stay voluntarily. The reality was far more complex. Despite an available path out, his identity dispute and psychological state prevented him from taking it. Soon after the film's release, Nasseri's health began to decline. Airport personnel noticed that he appeared more fatigued and disoriented. In late 2006, he suffered a medical emergency inside the terminal and was transported to a hospital. For the first time in 18 years, he was outside the airport's walls, not by choice, but by necessity. Following his hospitalization, French authorities arranged temporary housing in a shelter. He no longer returned to Terminal 1. The airport, which had been his home for nearly 2 decades, continued operating as usual, but the bench where he sat remained empty for the first time in years. After leaving the terminal, Nasseri lived in various care facilities. His public visibility decreased significantly, and media attention faded. Over time, he became a symbol of bureaucratic breakdown, psychological endurance, and the human cost of statelessness. His story highlighted gaps in international asylum policy and exposed how easily a person could become trapped in legal ambiguity. In November 2022, Nasseri briefly returned to Charles de Gaulle Airport, staying for several weeks. Airport staff, many of whom had never worked during his original residency, recognized the name from documentaries and articles. His final stay was short and unremarkable compared to the years he once lived there. Later that same year, he passed away from natural causes in Terminal 2F. His death marked the end of one of the most unusual human stories of the modern era, a man who lived longer inside an airport than many people live in a single home. His life became a case study in statelessness, a reflection of how easily identity can dissolve inside bureaucratic systems, and a reminder that international borders are not just lines on a map but barriers that can trap a person for decades. For 18 years, Terminal 1 was his world, his shelter, his routine, his boundary, and his identity. And in the end, the place that had confined him also became the place where his story concluded.